As we're sort of filtering in, I've added a website to the chat box. If anybody needs help with Zoom, let me know. I'm just making an assumption that you've all had to use Zoom at some point during the recent past. So if you need any help with navigating your way through Zoom, let me know. Raise your hand or say something. But I opened up the chat box, and in that chat box added a link to a native land map. So if everybody would like to sort of introduce themselves in the chat box and say what land you're on as an acknowledgement to the people who have lived here before us, that would be great.
Can you, I don't see that link in the chat.
Oh, I'll add it again. It might not have worked if you were not in your chat doesn't record that, or it doesn't catch up when you jump in. So there it is again.
There it is.
I'm also going to add in a second land acknowledgement, which is for the land itself. For those of us who live in urban environments, it might be interesting to think or to learn what was here on the land other than people besides or before we built and changed and shifted the landscape. So right where I live was Oak Savannah with lots of creeks. I live in Brooklyn, neighborhood of Portland, which is named after all the water that's actually underneath us right now, still running, but was buried over. Does anyone else have land acknowledgements they'd like to add? Thank you. So since we're a smallish group, thank you. We can unmute ourselves and sort of give short introductions and meet each other so that we feel a little more connected. This is being recorded, so it's optional. If you don't want to speak up, that's fine. But I'll start. My name is Rory, and I am a letterpress printer and bookbinder, and have been experimenting with botanical inks since 1996, and have recently, thank you for these land acknowledgements, have recently become much more, integrating it much more into my practice, my daily practice. So it's very exciting through gardening and also through philosophy and magic and science. So I teach at Pacific Northwest College of Art, and I'm an administrator for C3 Initiative in Portland. And I'm really excited to be here with you all. So if anyone else, we can just popcorn around if anyone else is interested in introducing themselves.
Sure. I'm Erin Dendrink. I also work at PNCA. And I'm here with my daughter and my dog TJ, so they might make an appearance also.
Great. My dog Apple is trying to make an appearance right now.
I'm Sharon Kallenberger. I am a graphic designer and letterpress printer, and I just love all craft things and ways of making art, and so I'm super excited for this class.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a student at PNCA.
Yeah.
And I'm also just interested in sort of different techniques for things than are commonly available, taught, easy to access. Excited to learn about botanical inks.
Great.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a recent grad of PNCA in the print media department. Rory has been my mentor for the past year, I think the year. Yeah, I am a studio manager at Niche House Press here in Portland. It's a letterpress print shop, and always looking for new things to add into my own practice. So excited to be here and see you all.
Hi, Anna. For those of you who are just jumping in, this is being recorded, just so you all know. We're having optional introductions right now if you'd like to say something. We're also, you may not see in the chats yet, but we've also added in native land acknowledgements for people and for land. I mentioned that I'm on Oak Savannah with many creeks, which was Brooklyn before we covered it up. And I am on the unceded, which corrected to unceded lands of the Cowlitz and Clackamas people. And Portland also represents 280 tribes living here today. And we're on stolen land built by stolen bodies and stolen labor. So with that said, are there any other folks who would like to do a little introduction since we're such a small group? No pressure. Hi, Abra.
Hi, Rory. Hi, everybody. I'm Abra. I also am a letterpress printer, and I work with Rory at PNCA in the print department. And I'm really excited to be a student of Rory's right now.
It's a little intimidating.
Why our video? Hi. I don't know why our video is not working, but this is Laura Height.
Hi.
And my son Leo's here, and really we signed up because Leo's very excited to learn how to make some botanical ink.
Yay.
He's giving me side eye because he didn't want me to tell you, but yeah, so we're here and we're really interested in what you've got to show us today.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Teague. I'm a PNCA student, and I've been having a lot of fun experimenting with botanical inks and exploring all of that. And this is my partner.
Hello, I'm Q. I'm here because I also enjoy art of all forms, and I really, really am excited about botanical inks.
Great. It's nice to finally meet you, Q.
Yes, hello. I've heard a lot about you.
Teague is an aspiring and amazing bookbinder and printer as well at PNCA, so it's exciting to have you here. Okay, let's get started unless anybody else would like to say anything or introduce themselves. Again, if you're just joining, this is being recorded, so you know. I'm going to share my screen with the slideshow, and we're going to sort of jump in and out of this slideshow throughout the next hour and a half, 2 hours or so. And since we're a small group, we can use chat if you don't feel like speaking up. If you have any questions, just sort of park them in the chat box. And also don't be afraid to just speak up. Just unmute yourself and speak up. I feel like that worked well last time I taught this. So don't be afraid to do that. So making botanical ink in your kitchen. Oops. So I wanted to start with an honorable harvest that Robin Wall Kimmerer has made popular. It is not hers that she wrote necessarily. This is a native tradition that I think is important to appreciate, not appropriate. And it reads, ask permission of the ones whose lives you seek and abide by the answer. Never take the first and never take the last. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Take only what you need and leave some for others. Use everything that you take. Take only that which is given to you. Share it as the earth has shared with you. Be grateful. Reciprocate the gift. And sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. So I think it's important to remember those things while we're harvesting material for botanicals. Am I on? Sorry, I think I'm on. I missed a slide or two. Yes, what happened here? Sorry, I'm trying to rearrange everything on my screen. Okay, so let's talk about foraging since we just read the Honorable Harvest. So you'll be surprised at what you can find in your own backyard or just on a walk around the block. We don't need to be using exotic materials or materials from other places to be making inks. We can even find lots at the grocery store and in your fridge and in your pantry. So also my chat box isn't up, and I'm gonna try one more time. I just wanna make sure I don't miss any questions. Okay. Why can I not open my chat box? So if you have a question, just speak up. I'm sorry, I'm not seeing my chat box, which is weird because I've been on Zoom for 1,000,000 hours and it's not like I don't know how to do this stuff. So let me try one more thing. Oops. Okay, sorry about that. Just speak up if you have a question. Okay, so when you're going on a walk around the neighborhood during this time when we all need to get a little bit of exercise and get out of the house, don't forget to bring things that that you might need to help you forage. So clippers or scissors, baggies. A Sharpie is helpful to write down what you gathered or what you think you gathered. Some gloves and a plant or a tree reference book or app would be helpful. One app that I really like is called iNaturalist. It's sort of a collective knowledge app where people add in photos and findings into the app, and it's sort of a growing sort of commons of knowledge around plants. So color might come from, another thing to remember is that color could come from any part of the plant. It can be the most colorful part, which would be fruits or flowers, but it can also come from buds or bark, or even the inner bark of a tree, roots or leaves or sap or stems, nuts, hulls, disease, lichen or moss, etc. So we read the Honorable Harvest. So I'm also very interested in collective learning. So I look forward to today and learning with you, and I'm interested in exploring collaborative ways of thinking, being, organizing, and making. So let's look at this as a collective learning moment and expand our capacity to cooperate in holistic, pleasurable, and emergent ways. So for urban foraging, a lot of things that you can find just on an urban walk are listed here, and I'm going to show photos of what each of those things look like. You might recognize them but not know the name. So St. John's wort grows abundantly in the Pacific Northwest, as well as rosemary. We've all seen rosemary here. Oregon grape. There are two different kinds of Oregon grape, the aquifolium and the nervosa. One is a tall Oregon grape and one is a shorter version. Cascara, buckthorn, the berries make beautiful ink. Don't eat them. Black walnut, it's actually the hulls of the walnut that make the ink, not the nut or the casing, the shell. So this green sort of outer husk is what you're going to be using to make ink, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Red alder cones, those sweet little tiny cones. Oregon white oak acorn caps make a beautiful gray ink. Blackberries as well. And there's a non-indigenous plant called pokeberry or pokeweed, which is an ornamental in a lot of places that has become an opportunist and spread far and wide, but it makes an incredibly bright pink, beautiful ink. So wanted to offer some thoughts on this word invasives. We tend to use a very adversarial language around plants that are not indigenous to where we are or maybe considered weeds. They do spread, but the reason that they spread widely is because they're in a habitat that is new to them and they may not have the same sort of balance here. So we use words like alien plant invaders or invasive species or nuisance species, foreign, weeds. And this is very sort of adversarial language. And I think it's important to think about how we approach living beings, especially right now. And this sort of adversarial attitude towards a living being can seep into other cracks in our lives. And I think it's really important to talk about how that can affect bias and racism and move into the way we think about people as well. So alternative language could be pioneer species, opportunists, introduced species. We're the ones who brought them here in the first place, non-indigenous or widespread species. So some further thoughts on language. And this is another thing that Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks about, is using a verb-based language versus a thing-based or a noun-based language. So referring to plants as that we're harvesting as pigment givers versus dye plants, and to think about how color is something is not something a substance has or owns, but something that it does. It gives color. So plants are living beings, which we know. And if we refer to them with animacy, we start to strengthen our relationships with nature and take responsibility for our part in that. And I urge you to read or to listen to podcasts that Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks about her suggestion of using the word ki or kin as a pronoun and adding that to he, she, they, ki, as for living beings that are not human or more than human. Has anybody heard of this before?
Hi, Rory. Yeah, I've heard of it, and it's something that I've been wrapping into my language more. And I explained it also to my husband, and so he and I have been working with ki and kin and find that it immediately feels right. And it also is a way for us to deeper explore our familial relationship with plants and animals and other beings. So yeah, it's been really kind of transformative for us, even though we're right at the beginning of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long process to sort of shift our language, isn't it? Does anyone else use this or have heard of this? There's a really great podcast, which I'll put in the chats in a little while, called Emergence Magazine. It's also a newsletter and print publication. But they did a book club for Braiding Sweetgrass, which is Robin Wall-Kimmerer's most recent book. And then she spoke at the end of the book club, and it's a really beautiful talk, and she mentions this concept of using he or kin as a pronoun. So
Rory, I think if I can find it, there's an earlier essay that Robin Walkhammer wrote for Orion magazine. So I'll see if I can put that in the chat as a share too.
Great. Thank you, Abra. Okay. So here's a quote, which I won't read. I didn't mention that I'm going to be giving you all a copy of this slideshow. I'll email it out after class. I'm also going to send a list of recipes that are way more detailed than what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to also send our chats, so any resources that are brought up in the chat. So don't feel like you have to be frantically taking notes during this. I'm going to send all of it. And then it's also being recorded, so you'll get a chance to what is going on? I'm experiencing Zoom things that I've never experienced before, and I'm not sure what's going on. What do you all see on the screen right now?
I think you're in the whiteboard.
Okay. Okay, do you see the quote now?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'll be sharing all this, so don't feel like you need to be taking all kinds of notes unless that helps you. So, oops. A note on living materials. So when we're thinking about gathering plants and botanicals for ink making, there are so many different variables that we have to consider. This concept of terroir, which you often hear in reference to wine, right? Is important in how and what type of color we're going to be getting from the botanicals. So different soil composition or place will give a different color to the same plant. The seasons, what time of year you're collecting the plant will change its color. The amount of precipitation in the air might change the way your plant gives color or pigment. The time of day that you're harvesting can even vary. So if you're harvesting in the morning when things are still sort of pert and lush and fresh, or in the afternoon after a long sunny day, might be a completely different color. Soil composition I mentioned in relation to terroir. Whether or not your matter or your pigment givers are dried or fresh will make a difference. Thinking about life cycles as well, whether you're harvesting when it's just coming up from the ground or later in its life cycle, or if it's already started to ferment on the ground, like walnut hulls, for instance, are best, like I said, not when they're green, but when they've fallen on the ground and have been sitting on the ground for a while and they start to turn almost black and they look all wrinkly and they've actually started to ferment a little bit, that gives you a much more intense ink. Lunar influence, why not? I mean, when we think about these concepts of biodynamics, biodynamic farmers will harvest their vegetables and fruits during a full moon. So when you think about tides, water is being sort of lifted toward the moon during its full moon cycle. So more, if we think about the influence on plants, more water will be drawn up, or more moisture will be drawn up into the fruit and leaves of the plant during a full moon. Fruit foraging. So like I said, there's a lot you can do, not even by leaving your house. So onion skins are an amazing pigment giver. Avocado peels and pits make a beautiful sort of mauve ink. Well, it can vary depending on where the avocado is growing and where it's from and all that. Rosemary, beets and beet greens, turmeric, even fresh or dried. Berries, tea or coffee make really beautiful pigments. Black beans makes gorgeous, black beans and pomegranate both make gorgeous like purple and black and blue inks. So let's get started thinking about the making of it. So the tools, it's very simple. One of my favorite things about ink making is to demystify it. And we can talk about differences between inks and dyes and things like that too. So for tools and materials, a non-reactive pan is best. So an enameled pan is your best bet, but not necessary. I also use cast iron sometimes in making ink because it acts as, it will shift the color of your ink, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. But that adds iron to the ink and sort of, they call it a saddener. So it can change it can shift the color of the ink to more of a gray or darker color, which I love. I think they're really beautiful. And I can show you some examples of that. Jars, lids, coffee filters, or a tea strainer is really helpful. Really fine mesh strainer. Some sort of spoon or stir stick. I like to use also, again, an enameled spoon. Because if you're using wood or a reactive material, it can shift the color if you're wanting to be very controlled about your ink making. Paper is really helpful to test your ink. And distilled water. I'm not using distilled water today. I'm just using from the tap, so distilled gives you a little more control, obviously, but you can certainly just use tap water as well. So there's vehicles, binders, and thickeners, which are also materials that you'll need. So all inks and paints utilize pigment. So that's what we're extracting from the botanicals. And that's the colorant. And then it sort of floats or is being held in a vehicle. So what differentiates one type of paint from another is the base or the vehicle that is employed to sort of bind these pigments together. So some of the more popular vehicles, as we know, are watercolor. So we can make a liquid watercolor or a cake watercolor. It can dry into cakes in a little pan so that you can have dried watercolors that you can carry with you to the field, or if you like to paint in a sketchbook and carry it with you. Gesso is made by adding whiting to, I know I'm on a really tiny little screen right now, but I'll show you these things afterwards too. This is like a chalk that's added to watercolor to create a more opaque paint. Tempera utilizes egg, and the fresher the egg, the better. So if you have chickens, does anybody want chickens? I have chicks. Message me if you want chickens. Encaustic is made by using wax as the vehicle. Casein paint uses milk, and acrylic, you can use like a binder, like a clear medium as your binder or vehicle. And then experiment. There's all sorts of different binders and vehicles you can use. Shellac, varnish, agar. I didn't mention oil. Can use linseed oil to make oil paint. Agar is a type of seaweed, so it makes a very thick gel-like paint, which you can screen print with. So you can screen print with natural dyes. Potato starch, rice starch, wheat starch, gelatin, or methyl cellulose are all different binders, and this is just a abbreviated list. So the binder in watercolor paint, so vehicle versus binder, I should clarify. Vehicle is what sort of holds the pigment. Water can be a vehicle as well, which is what I usually do. But then a binder is what binds the pigment to that vehicle. So gum arabic, which I'll show again on a larger screen, is the binder that I'm using when I make my inks. And we'll get to that in a second. So it increases viscosity of the paint. It helps the ink to flow onto the paper in a more controlled fashion, which you may or may not want. And it also binds the ink to the paper. It also helps preserve the color. It can shift the color a little bit as well, depending on the ink. And dry and wet pigments are both suitable for watercolor, which I'll talk about in a minute. Dry pigments are also called lake pigments. And then I mentioned gouache as well, with the addition of whiting chalk. So basic recipe is listed here. Don't have to really read it or memorize it. I'm going to demonstrate. So I'm going to stop the screen share so that you can see me a little bit better. Anybody have questions so far? We're all good? Okay. Great.
Rory, is a stainless pot considered a non-reactive pot?
No, but
steel?
I use stainless steel a lot. So, so yeah, you can, okay. It probably affects it a tiny bit, but I wouldn't worry about it. Okay, so I had to treat this like a cooking show and sort of prepare things ahead of time. So I've already made some walnut ink, which I'm going to show you. I just took it off the heat when we, I'm going to use this light to, it's tough. Okay, so inside this pot, let me shift my screen a little bit too. Inside this pot are walnut hulls, some water, and I cooked it on a really low heat for about an hour. If you have it on too high of a heat, it'll just cook away. We want it to reduce, and you can even thicken your ink by reducing it. That's one way of thickening, but you don't want it to boil away and have to add more water, because then you're basically diluting your ink. So you want to cook it really slowly on a really low heat. I have a gas stove, and it helps to use a diffuser. Does everyone know what a diffuser is? Yeah, okay. So like, if you don't have a diffuser for your gas stove, you can actually like put a pan down and put your pan inside the pan just to create more of a, or even a double boiler could work. You're not getting as much heat as you would, as is best, but it also works. So if you don't, like, you can use a double boiler as a diffuser. Also, crock pots work really well for making ink because they keep a really consistent heat that maintains for a long time. When I make a big batch of walnut ink in the fall or late summer, I often do it in a crock pot and just let it go for overnight, like 8 hours or 10 hours, and it makes beautiful, intense ink. So go to estate sales and find cheap crock pots for your studio work.
I was going to say, I got like a $5 crock pot at Goodwill that it's designated for this sort of thing.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, great.
Yeah, so.
So I like to keep strips of paper while I'm cooking so that I can periodically dip the paper into the ink until it gets to a point where I'm happy, and then I can take it off the heat. So I continually test. And sometimes I'll think, oh, that light is really nice, but I'd also like some darker. So I'm going to strain some of this lighter color off and keep that, or mix it with something else, which is also an option. I'll often mix two inks together to create a third color. And then I, continue to cook the rest of it. So that's an option. Let's see where we're at right now with this ink.
Rory, do you like to use a certain type of paper to do your test stripping, like knowing that you're going to use it for specific things?
Yeah. So if you know that you always print or work with cotton paper, use cotton paper to test, because as we're going to learn in a minute, acid plays a role in what color the ink is. So if we're working with an acidic paper, it's going to completely shift the color, and you might think you're getting a blue when it turns out to be a gray on non-acidic paper. Which also is one of the really exciting things about ink, is that it's like alchemy. The same exact ink painted on two different papers on the same day can be a completely different color, which is beautiful. And it's even more dramatic than like you know, painting, like we all know that ink can be translucent. So when you paint on like a yellow paper, it might be a completely different color than if you paint on a blue paper or a white paper. But this is like, this feels like alchemy because it's the acid that's changing the color, not necessarily that the ink is changing, or the ink is changing, but it's not that it's a visual shift because you're blending colors through paper, but you're blending colors through chemistry. Does that make sense? I don't know. I love the magic of it. So the walnut ink, it's got a lot of chunks in it still. Yeah, it's about the same as what that first or that second strip I showed you was. So now I'm going to, I'm going to show you how to strain this and add the gum arabic. So I'm gonna shift my computer a little bit. Sorry, this is awkward. I wish I had a webcam, but I don't. So we're just gonna sort of deal with this the best we can. So I use a funnel with a coffee filter inside and a jar. A lot of times I like to also strain into like a glass measuring cup with a funnel. So it makes it easier to pour into the next funnel that I'm going to, or with a spout rather, sorry. Glass jar with a, or glass cup with a spout. So just going to pour everything in here slowly. And sometimes you can get a second cook off of the material that you're working with. It'll be lighter, but you can often use it more than once. So if it's draining slowly, might be because the coffee filter is sort of getting clogged. So you can move things around and then let it drain for a little while longer and then sort of scoop the bottom to sort of move the particulate matter around. And then that is just dripping into the measuring cup. And then I'm going to transfer this. Then I like to use these brown dropper bottles for my ink. So it's got a little dropper with it. I ordered these on Amazon. Of course, we probably don't want to support Amazon right now, but you can get these at health food stores. Like I know New Seasons sells them even, but they're cheaper if you can buy them in bulk. And there's so many online resources that I'm sure you can find something. So I have a smaller funnel that I like to use for putting the ink into my little jar. So I'll just pour that in, being careful not to overfill. And then, so let's go back to the recipe real quick. So when I'm cooking, I like to chop up my material as much as possible, which we'll do in a second. And then I usually add about 2 cups of water to 1 cup, or 2 parts, let's call it that. We don't have to do in cups. 2 parts of distilled water to 1 part material. Sometimes more, sometimes less. If I want to cook it longer, and I know I want to cook it longer, and these are things you'll sort of learn by experience, I'll add more water so that it can reduce down longer. And then you heat it up to just below boiling. And then depending on the material or the color that you're looking for, you cook it for 45 minutes to 2 hours, really low heat. Crock pots, as I mentioned, work well. Testing the color as you go by dipping a strip of paper. Straining, we did that. And then, so for every 2 ounces of ink, I add about 10 drops of gum arabic. So show you how I do that. So I just use the actual dropper from my ink bottle, and I grab my gum arabic. This is pre-mixed gum arabic that I bought at an art supply store. You can also buy dry gum arabic. It comes in crystals or like little pellets, and then you add warm water and rehydrate it. It's a lot cheaper. So I suggest, and I have resources at the end of this too, I suggest buying, if you're gonna do a lot of this, I suggest buying the dried version. And then I just add 10 drops, 1, 2, because this is a 2-ounce bottle. So, and then shake it up. And then preservatives. This is a botanical material. So it will mold, it will rot. So if you're gonna use it really quickly, go ahead and just use it. But you can add different types of preservatives. So my favorite is just adding like 1 or 2 whole cloves. Sorry, it's so dark in here. So whole cloves, you can get at the grocery store. So I'll just put 1 right in the bottle. Does anybody know what the agent is in cloves that works as a preservative? I don't know the name of it. I should Google that. Oops. So if you, another preservative you can use is thyme oil or clove oil. So you can buy like an essential oil. The thyme has a really strong smell, which is beautiful. But if you're sensitive to smells, I wouldn't use the thyme oil. I would just use a whole clove, or not even clove oil, because it's pretty intense. But it works great, and it just integrates right into the ink. You can also use wintergreen oil, but I don't recommend it because it's actually pretty, even though it is a natural material, it's pretty toxic. So if you get it on your skin or breathe it in, it can be harmful to you. So, so yeah, don't use wintergreen oil if you can help it. So those are some natural preservatives that you can use. Does anybody have questions so far?
I have a question. I've seen some recipes that suggest some form of alcohol, I guess, as a preservative. What do you think about that?
Well, there are also alcohol extractions.
Okay.
So I don't typically use alcohol as a preservative. It does work. One nice thing about adding alcohol, nice, perhaps, not necessarily always nice, but one thing that will do is it will make your ink flash off faster, meaning it'll dry faster. So like alcohol extractions, turmeric, dried turmeric is a great candidate for alcohol extraction. So you can boil the dried turmeric, but it doesn't make as intense of a color as the alcohol extraction. Let me show you this color, it's amazing. Look at that, beautiful. I mean, it's like fluorescent. I wish the computer were better. Yeah, it's so beautiful. And that will dry really fast because it's alcohol and it sort of evaporates really quickly. There, that's kind of a good representation of the color. It's so beautiful. You can also cook fresh turmeric root if you're not into using the alcohol. So yes, you can use alcohol as a preservative. I'm gonna cover this turmeric before I bump it, knock it over. Okay, I also wanted to show you the walnut. So that's the like dried walnut after it's sort of turned brown, after it's been sitting on the ground for a while. In this batch of walnut ink that's so intense and dark and beautiful, I only used 2 walnuts. So you don't really need a ton of material necessarily unless you're making a big batch. And be careful with the walnut because it will stain your hands. Like when you're foraging them and gathering them, maybe bring gloves if you care. I think it's kind of beautiful to have stained fingers, but may not be for everyone. So yeah, the walnut's incredible. And these have been dried, dehydrated, and I just keep a bag of them and use use them as I need them. Because if I'm not using a bunch of the ink or giving a bunch of the ink away, it does go bad. It does shift in color. So it gets moldy, I guess. So,
hey Rory, will
yeah.
you be talking? Hi. Will you be
Hi.
talking about fixes later?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
For sure. Okay. Let's go back to the slideshow. So, mordants. So to shift color or to make ink more permanent. Wait, did I skip? There it is. So a mordant is a chemical. You typically hear about it when you talk about dye, natural dyeing, because you use it to help the ink or the pigment affix to the cloth. So when you think about what cloth is and what paper is, has anybody made paper before? Yeah, so paper is like cloth in a different form. So it's made of, fibers, lignin fibers or cellulose fibers, plant fibers typically, not always. No, always. Yeah, paper's always plant fibers. So the mordants can help, if you add a mordant to your ink, it can help attach the color to the paper and help it bite into that paper and hold its color longer or more. So some additives, so some mordants that we can use are alum. You can buy this in the grocery store. I don't suggest that you buy it in its clump form, like in its rock form. I suggest that you buy it already ground because it's kind of hard to grind. So alum is potassium aluminum sulfate, and I bought this at an art supply store, a big bag of it for you find it in the dyeing section. You can add this. Sometimes, well, I'll get to that in a second. So alum, copper, you could just toss a penny into your cook if you want to add a mordant. Iron oxide, so like a rusty nail, that will shift the color, like I said, to more of a darker, saddened color. I don't like to use that word though, because I love those grays. If any of you know me, this is kind of like my uniform is gray. So I love the more grayed out colors. Cream of tartar, which you can also find in the grocery store, tartaric acid, is a byproduct of winemaking, and that can also work as a mordant. So you can also shift color by modifying the pH. We talked about that with acid and paper. You can use vinegar or wine. You can, as you start your cook, you can add maybe a tablespoon of vinegar and a tablespoon of salt at the beginning to sort of boost your color. Lemon juice, baking soda, borax, lye, those are all things that will modify your pH, either by making it more acidic or more alkaline. We talked about preservatives a little bit. Other ways to preserve your ink are to put them in a refrigerator. That will help extend the life, just like it does with our foods. Storage in dark bottles will extend the life of your ink. And then also extraction or dehydration. That greatly extends the life of your ink. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. We're not going to do that today. That's a different class. But one way is to pour out or to take your ink and pour it into a shallow dish and put it out in the sun. And it will dry into, well, I'll show you this on a larger screen again, but it will dry into like little flakes that you can then grind and add into trans base for letterpress or any kind of other medium that you're wanting to use. So here's where our collective knowledge comes in. Let's talk about impermanence. So the one question I get every time I teach this class is, how long do these last ink, or do these inks last, or does the color shift, or how do you keep it from fading? So let's talk about why that concerns us. And oops, I want to type in while we're thinking this through together, and sort of add some thoughts about impermanence and why this is important to us, and why it shouldn't be, or why it's beautiful, or why how we can use it as a concept within our work. So just speak up. And I'm going to pull out.
I feel like it's so tied to archives, things lasting forever, and it's a very colonial thought. Thing is like a commodity that should last, you know.
I was just going to say that because nothing is permanent.
Yes. Oops.
I was thinking a lot of art tends to like preserve the memory of the artist. So there's a certain element of ego in the idea of it lasting forever or a long time.
I'll use the word legacy. Ego. Yes. What else?
I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of a reference point. Like if you're, I don't know, if there's a need to, I don't know, maybe explain to a future generation about what you were seeing at that time. I don't know if maybe that is preserves the memory or legacy, but you know, when I think of like the color charts, you know, that have been done to represent this particular bird or something, that seems like I would think that that would be important for the color to somehow be, to not change.
Future knowledge of the past. Okay.
To me, there's something so beautiful about artworks being able to change over time. So I think about, like, for my job, my boss has been concerned about the archival nature of his pigments staying the same. And I understand that when someone's buying a piece and spending money, but I think part of me just wants to be like, well, wouldn't that be beautiful if it shifted over time in your living room and that kind of thing?
I'm also going to add in that quick little comment you made about purchasing work and the promise we give to our clients. To our patrons.
I was going to say the flip side of nothing is permanent is that everything is part of each other. So if, you know, I don't know how to explain this. Everything degrades, but it degrades into itself. So it's a weird concept to mourn something transmutating into itself, you know, another form of itself. So that's kind of, I don't know how to say that in a shorter way.
No, I hear you. I love that word, transmutating.
That word transmutating kind of gets back to that alchemic nature of the ink that you were talking about.
Yeah, something that I was thinking about that feels related to this is how we need decay to live. Like, decay is life.
Waste food.
What about urgency? Does that come up for anyone? I think when I make an ink, knowing that it will mold or decay or not be used, it makes me want to use it more. It makes it sort of like inspires me to create more often and to use it, which I think is an interesting byproduct of impermanence. It's also, I think we were sort of getting into that with the decay, but the sort of like an extension of life, right? Like it's a different cycle on a different timeline, but it sort of reminds us of these sort of feelings about our timeline.
I think it's like also a flipping of the idea of an archive. When something decays, it's still an archive. It's still a document of its life cycle. It's just it's just a different way of looking at how we archive
Yeah.
things change over time.
Mm-hmm.
But when I make work, whether it's textile or other, I always think about, I'm excited to see it change over time, like get ripped, and because it's part of a document of its life.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about planning for the eventuality of the change of the material. So like the final work in 50, 100 years is intended to look different than it was created originally. Like the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco this hasn't happened yet, which it's not on time, but it was built to get vertigo on it. Like it's supposed to be green. It's not green yet. It hasn't happened yet, but it's designed to have that as part of what it looks like in the end, even though it didn't look like that when they first built it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's something beautiful about that event of the change, the slow change over time, and to be thinking about process even after the artist has been removed from the work. Let's move on to the next piece of collective knowledge, color. I think I want to start this conversation by thinking about perception and bias and how in our language we use words and thoughts about color. So why is white pure, or considered pure or wholesome or clean? Why is black, oops, black is dirty, dangerous? Why do we perceive black as less than pure, less than beautiful, less than and how does that seep into our everyday thinking about other beings, other people?
I think this is similar to the permanence thing. Like there's no such thing as white and there's no such thing as black. And obviously when you're working in botanicals, you can observe that really fast, So I think, again, color is another colonial approach to categorizing things that can't be categorized, because there are so many more colors than we can name and understand. And, it's a spectrum, not a set of names, at least in my opinion.
It's kind of interesting when you think about like what is white light, is all the colors in the spectrum kind of coming together to create that pure white light. But the same could maybe be said for like the color black. It's also when all colors come together. It's more just amusing, like trying to kind of figure out where I'm going with this exactly, but it's everything and nothing at the same time. Both of them are,
The concept of white being pure and black being dirty or dangerous is also like inherently Western, because colors don't mean the same things in every culture. And so that is what we've become accustomed to as Americans, steeped in those ideas, but we can look elsewhere and find other meanings for those colors too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. It also makes us reassess how we're using language all in all, like where does, how do we use our language through color over time, and what are those meanings steeped in?
Yeah, and there's also gender associations that have shifted with color. We all know that, or I think we might all know the sort of history of pink used to be a very masculine color, or masculine, and now is considered, you know, it's like Barbies and girls, right? So like thinking about how gender is also linked to color in weird ways.
I also, coming from a textile background, have a lot of thoughts on the concept of like white as pure, because the process to get a white textile requires removal or bleaching processes on the fibers themselves. So white is inherently like a capitalist ideal, the ability to remove color from organic material and keep it, you know, washed away, clean. It has a capitalist, you know, construct attached to it. And then black I think of as like the presence of all color. The color is really worked into the fiber, the material itself, and is actually a lot richer. So I think of black in a very natural way. It's not the removal, it's the presence of color. It is the it's more tangible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next thought. What about cultural significance in relation to inks, dyes, color?
I won't say a lot. I'll just say that from where my tribes are from in Vietnam, you know, we have the hill tribes have a huge history of dyeing. As the Hmong uses the dark blue and the which some people call black, and then the red Zhao they use predominantly this cochineal, but obviously that in the fashion industry those specific aesthetics have been really co-opted. So I don't have a lot to. I mean, I have a lot to say, but I won't go into it now. But I think for me, color and how color is achieved is so core to like my cultural identity, and it's something that I'm still trying to understand in a Western context.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to also, while we're working with certain materials, to sort of pay reverence to their histories, whether that be complicated histories like indigo. You know, indigo is interesting because it's such a hot thing right now. Like everybody wants to be wearing and using indigo, and not many people know its complicated colonial history, that indigo played a larger part in slave labor than cotton even. And I think it's important to sort of educate yourself about these histories and what we're promoting and how we're using these materials and how we're paying reverence to the way they got here and to the way that we're using them. And that goes into appropriation versus appreciation as well. You know, there are many cultures that use indigo, not just Japan. Shibori is sort of the thing that everybody associates indigo with, but Africa was using indigo long before Japan was. South America, there's a huge indigo tradition in South and Central and Mexico. So to be thinking about those histories is important. Anyone else have?
I don't know if this is totally along the lines of what you're thinking, but it's made me think of how when you want to paint your house, there's a lot of pressure from the neighborhood to fit in, kind of like we've all agreed to be neutral here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Equals neutrality.
Yeah, I wanted to add in that there's obviously there's big business around color and like trends of colors, and the way in which capitalism feeds into color trends is disheartening, I guess I would say, but it's been happening for years.
Yeah, I think that sort of that industry and business surrounding color is also super complicated. So I'll just read a few things that from the last time I taught this, people brought up. Making from colors that are around or near you adds a richer aspect to your art or from your experience in life. So thinking about hyperlocality is also cultural. And what's growing around you. I thought that was an interesting point. We have complex interpretations and associations with color, which we've sort of talked about. Somebody said it connects us to the ancestry that they're just discovering. It's a private connection, but collective. Okay, should we move on to the next one? So also thinking about our current moment and how, you know, a lot of us are choosing to be in our homes right now. How does that change the way we think about making? How does making in a kitchen vary from making in a studio? Or how does making, you know, at your living room coffee table change the way you make, or in your backyard, or whatever it is?
I feel like it really brings in what you're talking about with referencing Robin about taking only what you need, taking only what you're going to use, and abandoning this idea of surplus. And surplus for me is a very colonial thing as well, you know, always needing to have stockpiling and keeping other people from having it. And also just like letting go of that idea of if I have all these things, then, you know, I'll be prepared for any sort of creative endeavor. It's more so using what you have and being intentional about it. In a way, I personally have studio access, but I'm kind of, I think this moment has gotten me to think about not necessarily following this trajectory of an art student and emerging artist of like finding a studio space and paying for that, just more so consolidating and using the space that I already have and using my home and sanctuary as that studio.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something about ingenuity in finding different ways to use the things you do have access to, and being able to grow through that process. Like normally you might just go buy the thing you need, but if you have to think about it in a different way because going out to buy it feels difficult, you may end up somewhere that you didn't expect to go because of that process.
I think that one thing I always say to my students is that limitations, what's the word I'm looking for? Like there's a better word, creativity. In the last class, somebody talked about how thinking about childhood and being sort of stuck at home in their childhood like those sort of thoughts are coming up, and so they're becoming more playful in the way that they create because they're being reminded of childhood times, which I thought was interesting. Another person said they were excited to remake relationships to plants and deepen them through their garden. One person said that it makes ordinary feel extraordinary.
I think for me, one of the harder parts of making at home as somebody who always works in a really lively space is that loss of community and collaboration that happens within kind of a shared space of making, and how are the ways in which we can, I mean, something like this helps, you know, this sort of coming together, but what are the ways in which we could come together to make it a communal making and collaborative making?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of along that line, I feel like I can be a very isolated artist. I don't like anyone watching me when I'm making or being around me, but being at home and not living alone, that requires of me to like be vulnerable and share, like me messing around and stumbling around with it, which would be different if I lived alone, of course, but
Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts? All right, maybe we should move on to the next one. So I added this in because one of the beautiful things to me about ink making is that you have unexpected results often. And oh shoot, I was going to start some other colors going while we were talking. So you might expect a certain color, or have gotten a certain color from a plant in the past, and then it shifts drastically. So this is often sort of seen as a failure if you're really wanting to recreate something. So like shifting those perceptions of what failure is or means to you, and then shifting those sort of thoughts into like, how can that become magical? These sort of unexpected things that happen while you're working with living materials. I'm gonna start talking, and I'm gonna go put some onion skins on the stove. I also chopped up a bunch of rosemary too into little bits, and I'm using just the leaf or the needle of the rosemary. I'm not using the stems for this particular one. No thoughts about failure and magic?
I feel like the two terms, me being a printmaker, is very printerly. We inherently fail and take proofs and keep going until we get to a place that we're happy with. But there's also like always that magic in the reveal of pulling a print and seeing what it looks like. So the iterative process of printmaking is inherent to that, but also inherent to failure and magic and experimentation.
Yeah.
I think it's the beautiful part of the process of making, both the failure and the magic.
Thanks, Doug. That was Doug, right? I recognize your voice.
Yes. I'm eating or I'd have my camera on.
I also think about meditation a lot, and making and creating and being in that art process is being meditative. But meditation is also like a series of failures, if we want to look at it that way. You know, you sit there and you're like, oh, I got wrapped up in that thought, I failed, try again. And that's like the whole process is just kind of a circuitous journey of those failures, but also successes, and then that, you know, kind of transcendence, that magic of getting to a point of being just in the moment.
Nice.
I like to think of failure and magic as kind of like part A, an experimentation, and then also as failure isn't failure. You're not inherently failing when you get a different color out of an ingredient, but it's just another answer.
Mm. Right. I like that. Approaching it from the thought of it being an answer. That's nice. What is, I mean, let's do the antithesis of failure. What does success mean to people? Do we have ideas of what a success is?
Learning something.
Yeah. So that turns failure on its head, because failure is instructive.
I think that we've been taught that success is really goal oriented, like it's about achieving something, as opposed to what Vo just brought up with the idea of learning. So it's not necessarily about the end goal, but it's about process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some things that folks said in the last class was failure is time sensitive and lives with you briefly. And consider conversations about what ink should be. And we don't know what works without knowing what doesn't. And all that is in between these two, to embrace unpredictability. So let's end on generosity. One thing that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about is it possible, you know, like when we tend a garden, for instance, it can be said that we love that garden and we love those plants, but do they love us back?
I think there's something in the abundance of nature. The idea that I live in an apartment, I don't have a garden of any sort, but I still could go out into the neighborhood and forage things that could become the foundation of a piece of art. And that's really like the generosity of nature in its abundance.
Mhm. Yeah, I like to say that scarcity is a mindset.
Think about like what Bo said about everything is impermanent, and generosity, then linking it again to Robin's writing, Braiding Sweetgrass. At one point she talks about whatever is given is meant to be given away. So it's a continual, if you receive something, keep that giving kind of train going. So there's that ephemeralness of holding what is given and what has been generously transplanted to you, and so on and so forth.
I was going to say something similar in terms of the opposite of gatekeeping. You know, I consider myself a community member, a member of a learning community. And when I first met Skylar Demarinis, it was so cool because he passed on so much knowledge. He was so generous with his time, his teaching, and I hope to do the same, like pass on knowledge that I have in teaching. But also he would always like, here's some indigo, or like just constantly like being generous with this knowledge that I am so used to being privatized. So yeah, I think just thinking about the opposite of gatekeeping with knowledge and time,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously resources like equipment as well.
Yeah. Skylar was supposed to be here today. Are you here, Skylar? I don't think so.
I think about, you know, for me at least, generosity, that word has these connotations of giving to someone else, but what does it mean to be generous to oneself as well?
Mm-hmm. What about sort of this thought about our language and how, you know, notions that weeds, not even notions, facts, that weeds can be medicine. So shifting our language as a generous act. And thinking about gift economies, solidarity economies.
An extension of what Abra said earlier, generous with open-endedness. Like I think that's connected, and not being tied to a single outcome or being attached to, yeah, it's like generous with your attachments and with your expectations and that stuff, and not of just you, but as not from just yourself, but from resources, like what we sometimes think of nature as a resource.
Mm-hmm.
How can we be more generous in applying that thinking to objects?
I had a mentor who said that it must hurt a little bit to give a gift. It should be something that you care about and are releasing. And he always gives gifts of things that he's owned or lived with for a while, and is ready to pass them on to the next person. Okay, thank you, everyone. I appreciate your generosity in building collective knowledge together. So let's talk about tracking and research and recipes and things like that. There's two different ways of approaching ink making. Obviously, we can be very scientific about our approach and be using measurements carefully and beakers and all the chemicals and keeping notes of exactly how much we added and what part of the process it was added in and how many drops and all that sort of thing. And I appreciate that. I come from a craft background, which I think is a very controlling way of thinking about materials. I think craft is amazing and beautiful, but it does tend to give people this sort of like power over materials in some ways, and sort of like killing the material itself. Not in every case, obviously. So keeping detailed notes may not guarantee consistent results, but keeping a journal about the way you felt that day or what was happening with the weather or how you harvested might give you more information about how you came to that color than keeping really scientific notes. Kitchens aren't laboratories. Kitchens are places of creativity, nourishment, generosity. So when I make inks in my kitchen, I have a different attitude towards the making of them. Research, such as reading and Googling and all that, can provide cerebral knowledge, but mistakes while you make, or eating the botanicals that you're cooking with can provide an embodied knowledge, smelling and feeling and observing in ways that start very large and then zoom into details. So there are lots of other pigment givers. Bugs, Vo mentioned cochineal. Kermes is another bug. This is a very short list, but you can think about pigment coming from the sea, from seaweed and mussels and snails. Can come from the earth or dirt, like ochre or sienna or umber. Mineral, which is also earth, but more stones like lapis lazuli and malachite and viridian are pigment givers. Metals like copper and iron. Petroleum, so these little paraffin candles that you get for emergency situations when your power goes out. If you burn this and collect the soot in a spoon, you get the most beautiful lamp black ink. It's labor intensive, but it's really beautiful. Mammalian pigments, bone, flesh, and then human made also. We can think about urban foraging. Gypsum from drywall makes a really beautiful white paint or ink. I've seen people make ink with cigarette butts before. So thinking about those sorts of things. So I mentioned lake pigment, which we're not going to get too much into, but one of my students, Robin Apley, is an amazing maker, and they taught me how to make lake pigment that they learned on a residency in Mexico. So like I said, you can either just let it dehydrate, and that takes many days, or you can add alum and calcium or sodium carbonate in, and I have a recipe for this that I'll send you, to the ink after it's been cooked and strained. And then it does this beautiful alchemical thing where it collects all the pigment away from the water. It draws the pigment to the alum and sodium carbonate. And then you pour this through a funnel, just like I did with the walnut ink, through a coffee filter. So this is the filter that I poured this particular pigment through. And this is logwood, which also has a complicated history. So the result is this dry pigment, which I can show you, that can be added to any kind of medium, including oil. So adding ink that you've cooked down with water, you can't add to oil, right? Because oil and water don't mix, but you can add this dried pigment to oil-based medium like letterpress inks and things like that. So it also extends the shelf life, which I mentioned before. So there's tons and tons of books out there to learn more of this. It's really not a difficult process. One of the books that I really love that's new is this one by Jason Logan. it's not a super technical book, but it gives all the basics, and I really love his approach and his philosophy to making ink. So this is a great one, and it's ink specific. So there's another one that I don't have here called Botanical Inks Plant to Print to Dyes. So basically, like any, I mentioned this at the bottom here, but any book about natural dyeing can also just apply to inks. So basically, inks are just a more concentrated version with gum arabic added and thickened typically. So that's the only difference between inks and dyes. So so yeah, any book about natural dyeing works great for an ink maker. There's also the Organic Artist, Botanical Art Techniques, Botanical Color at Your Fingertips, all kind. I mean, there's so many. This is another little booklet about cochineal. I have a friend who's an ink maker, and he is like, oh my God, like he's got like thousands and thousands and thousands of recipes. It's insane. He like goes deep when he wants to learn something. So I mentioned him in our resources as well. His name is Richard Spelker, but he's on the resource page. Even just thinking about color as a way to research. So this is about a woman named Emily Noyes Vanderpool, who was a woman of means who could sit around and paint these beautiful grids of color as associated to a mummy cloth that she saw in a museum, or a panel of the Taj Mahal, or a Celtic ornament. But it's a really beautiful sort of meditation on color and organization of color. We should have talked about naming as well. I think that's interesting. Werner's Nomenclature of Color, to be thinking about naming. There's a whole series of books published by Whitechapel Gallery, and this is they're sort of a collection of essays from all time. Like they can range from history to present day. So they're usually just short little excerpts, and then if you find something that you're interested in, you can dive in further. This is an interesting one as well. The Secret Lives of Color by Cassia St. Clair. She goes through and talks about brief histories of color, which some are really amazing and interesting, and some are really difficult and political and dangerous. And then this is called An Atlas of Rare and Familiar Color. And I don't know if any of you have heard about the color collection at Harvard University, but this is sort of an archive of their color collection, their pigment collection, which is amazing. So it's got a lot of information about different types of pigment and all of that in there. And then there is, if you're interested in mineral pigments or earth pigments, this is another good book, Earth and Pigments, Hand Gathering and Using Natural Colors in Art by Sandy Webster. But there's so many. Then suppliers, Kramer Pigment sells a lot of dried botanical matter that you can purchase if you're looking to try something that doesn't grow here, or if you're doing a huge batch and you need a lot of it or something like that. They offer a catalog as well. Sinopia is another supplier online. Botanical Colors is a BIPOC owned and operated supplier as well, which I try to support as much as possible. Earthpigments.com, naturalpigments.com. So there's lots of resources online. And then also look at artists' work and what they're doing. So I mentioned Rich Spelker. So he has a project called Ink Cabinet. And I have resources, links in this document as well that I can send. Tilka Elkins is doing something called the Wild Pigment Project, which is amazing. Check her out for sure. Scott Sutton calls himself the Pigment Hunter. I'm mostly listing friends and local people here. Scott used to live in Portland, but now lives in New Mexico. Robin is who I mentioned, who taught me to make the lake pigments. And then Vibrant Valley Farm they're indigo farmers on Sauvie Island. And there's so many more. I mean, that's just a really, like Skylar, who lives here, is working with botanical color a lot. So yeah, thank you. And stay in touch.